Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for watching and listening. So I'm Daniel Nachtigall, economist at the Environment Directorate of the OECD. And in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'd like to highlight the key results of our paper, the role of carbon pricing in the sustainable recovery from COVID-19. That paper was actually developed for the Carbon Market Platform. The Carbon Market Platform is an initiative that brings together a wide range of countries to strengthen international cooperation on carbon pricing. So before I start, let me just say that it's a joint work with my colleagues, Jane Ellis and Sophie Ehrendal. So what I'm planning to do in the next 15 to 20 minutes is to provide first a little bit of context, then dive deep into the paper and talk about carbon pricing in the economic recovery, so state of play and observed trends, then some words on carbon pricing revenue potential and use, and finally summarizing the key takeaways. So as we have seen, I mean, besides the human suffering, COVID-19 has had really extensive economic and social impacts globally. And so due to the major disruptions, so COVID-19 has encouraged some governments to really rethink and reset their policy priorities. And the decisions that are taken now, in particular with respect to long-lived infrastructure, will really determine the emissions of the future. And that makes it actually even more important that the recovery is sustainable and does not lock in emissions. So sustainable recovery should actually address a number of goals. So first and foremost, it should increase or restore well-being. So in particular, jobs, housing, but also more broadly achieving the sustainable development goals. It should also mitigate climate change and therefore also the likelihood to reach NDCs and the Paris Agreement. And it should increase resilience to climate change, but also more broadly. So what are we doing actually in this paper is to answer the question, what is the role of carbon pricing in the sustainable recovery? So first, we are tracking policy changes in carbon pricing since the start of COVID-19. Second, we identify additional challenges to, but also rationale for carbon pricing related to COVID-19. I won't talk so much about that today. And finally, we discuss policy design options to overcome those challenges. And here in that presentation, I'll focus in particular on revenue potential and use. So the purpose of the tracking exercise is really like to track policy changes in carbon pricing since the start of COVID-19. So what we are doing is we do desk research, so that's mostly based on databases, both inside and outside the OECD. We also carry out country interviews with selected countries. In terms of coverage, we cover 47 OECD and G20 countries and selected subnational carbon pricing schemes in between January 2020 and August 2021. So we cover the following instruments, so emission trading schemes, energy taxes, carbon taxes, and fossil fuel subsidies, and also aviation taxes. So for example, changes in passenger duty taxes. So strictly speaking, those are not carbon prices, but they can be seen as a proxy for carbon price in international or domestic aviation. So what are we tracking is the number of policy changes in carbon pricing that was implemented or announced in the time period announced above. And we also include policy changes regardless of whether they are planned before or during COVID-19. So what is not included are the expected impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, simply because there is no data available. So in total, we distinguish for the tracking exercise 5 different categories. So dark green and red means that there are permanent policy changes in carbon pricing with an expected positive, so it green, or negative, so red climate effect. So for example, a new carbon tax would get a dark green color code. And then we have also the light red and the light green color codes. That's temporary policy changes with expected positive or negative climate effect. And finally, the white color code is no change. So how does the picture look like for carbon taxes, ETS, and energy taxes? So before I start to go into detail here, the important thing is really to notice in the graphs that we are only looking at changes since the start of the pandemic, so not the status quo. So for example, we are well aware of the fact that Sweden has a carbon tax, but since there hasn't been any change in the carbon tax since the beginning of 2020, it is labeled here as a no change. And finally, let me also mention that the indicator, the number in the boxes indicates the number of changes in one country. So if we look for these, the first 3 policy instruments at the color codes, then we see it's essentially exclusively green, and almost all instruments are designed to be permanent. However, if we dig a little bit deeper, we also see that the majority of them has been actually planned before COVID-19, but was implemented between January 2020 and August 2021. So for fossil fuel subsidies and aviation taxes, there have been actually mostly climate negative changes. So that's why the red color. And I mean, that's mostly related for aviation taxes, for example, because to mitigate essentially the negative impacts on the international aviation industry. And similarly, we have seen a lot of movements for fossil fuel subsidies to protect industry from low international oil prices, or also to protect vulnerable household groups. So if we look at the color code, I mean, it's mostly red, but most of it is actually also light red. So that means most of the changes are designed to be temporary changes. So we also had a look at subnational carbon pricing schemes. And if we look at those, then we see that the picture looks more or less similar to the picture that we saw in the national policy changes in carbon pricing. So for carbon taxes and ETS, it's mostly climate positive changes apart from British Columbia and Canada. For aviation taxes and fossil fuel subsidies, it's actually exclusively climate negative policy changes. And then again, all positive changes are planned to be permanent, whereas all negative changes are planned to be rather temporary. So what are the general patterns of climate positive and negative changes? So in total, we observe 41 national or supranational changes, climate positive changes, and 7 on a subnational level. And we observe slightly more, so 58 negative, climate negative changes and 12 on the subnational level. So climate positive changes seem to be mostly permanent. So if we look at the picture on the right-hand side, we see that almost all climate positive policy changes are designed to be permanent, and some 80% of climate negative policy changes are actually designed to be time limited. And there can be, let me also say that there can be actually quite a huge range of the time limitedness. So it can be just a few weeks, but it can also go to several years. So then climate positive changes, most of them actually tend to be planned before COVID, but have been implemented during COVID-19. So that's why they are within the scope of our paper, whereas climate negative changes are mostly government responses to the pandemic. And finally, climate positive changes also seem to be larger and broad, both in terms of coverage and price level. So for example, the Chinese ETS that started operating in 2021 covers 40% of Chinese greenhouse gas emissions, whereas climate negative changes are more narrow in scope, most of the time just focusing on specific sectors such as aviation. So how does the picture look like when looking at countries? So this graph here shows the number of countries that make changes in carbon pricing across all instruments. And we can see that it's actually fairly symmetric. So 12 countries have only implemented changes with negative climate impact. Then 10 countries implemented changes with only climate positive impact. And in the middle, we can also see that 15 countries have sent mixed price signals. So they strengthened the price signal for some instruments, but at the same time, they also weakened it for others. And then on the right-hand side, we see that 10 countries in total also had no changes in their carbon pricing policy during COVID-19. So what we also did was to compare the changes in carbon pricing with the degree of the greenness of the recovery packages. So here's that graph on the x-axis shows the changes in carbon pricing by category, so the same categories that we saw in the previous slide. And the y-axis shows the share of spending in clean energy on total recovery spending. So that's based on data from the Energy Policy Tracker, and we have data for most, but not for all OECD and G20 countries. So here I really would like to draw your attention to the 4 colored areas. So if we start with the lower left, where actually most countries are in, then those countries are really relatively clearly move into the wrong direction. So they have like a low share of green fiscal spending, and they have only or mostly climate negative policy changes related to carbon pricing. So the opposite holds actually true for the upper right. So here we have 5 countries, so Sweden, Canada, Great Britain, New Zealand, and China, that have both a high share of green spending in the recovery packages and also mostly climate positive policy changes related to carbon pricing. And then we have also the lower right and the upper left. So there's some inconsistency between green fiscal spending and carbon pricing signals. So it can be either that there are high shares of fiscal spending, but climate negative policy changes related to carbon pricing, so the upper left, or the other way around, that we have mostly climate positive changes in carbon pricing, but a relatively low share of green fiscal spending, so that's the lower right. And finally, what we also did is we wanted to see whether the direction of policy changes depend on countries' wealth. And here, so for example, whether rather rich countries carried out climate positive changes, whereas emerging economies had more climate negative changes. And here in that graph, we plot the GDP per capita on the y-axis and the changes in carbon pricing by category on the x-axis. And by and large, what you can see from the blue line in the middle is that there is virtually no correlation between countries' wealth and the degree of climate positive or negative changes. So then let me come to the carbon pricing revenue and potential use. So this graph here shows the actual and potential revenue from carbon pricing based on data in 2018. So the blue bar indicates the actual revenue from carbon pricing, and the orange bar indicates the revenue from carbon pricing if all energy-related CO2 emissions were priced at least 30 euros per ton. And so a couple of observations here. So first, all countries could increase their revenues when they increase carbon pricing in areas that are currently priced below 30 euros. The second observation is that the revenue potential differs substantially across countries. So in particular, some emerging countries like China, India, or South Africa show really the highest potential for raising revenue through carbon pricing. Third observation is that across all OECD and G20 countries, revenue potential is approximately 1.88% of their GDP. And fourth, also please bear in mind that here we have only energy-related CO2 emissions. So if all emissions were to be taken into account, then the 1.88% would probably increase by approximately 50%. So one thing is that despite the revenue potential, increasing or implementing carbon pricing has been challenging for countries even before COVID. And so in fact, if you look at public opinion polls, then carbon pricing or enacting carbon pricing seems to be consistently by far the least popular climate policy compared to other policies. However, if you look a little bit deeper, you also see that the political acceptability of carbon pricing heavily depends on the recycling mechanisms. And so this graph here shows the support rate for carbon pricing under different revenue recycle mechanisms. So that's based on ongoing OECD work that carries out public opinion surveys in selected OECD countries about the public acceptability of carbon pricing and also climate policy more broadly. And so here that graph is taken from Denmark, but similar patterns are also seen in other countries. So I actually don't want to go too much into detail here, but just highlight 4 key observations. So from bottom to top, the first thing that we see is supporting low carbon technologies has by far the highest support, up to 60%. So the second observation is protecting vulnerable household groups. So for example, cash transfers to the poorest households gets also a lot of support. Third, reducing the public deficit gets kind of moderate support. So in Denmark, there are still more people that support that revenue recycling mechanisms than that do oppose it. And finally, we also see that the least support gets actually a reduction of corporate income taxes. So then we ask the question, so okay, so how actually how countries are actually using carbon pricing revenue? And here that is also based on data from OECD and G20 countries from 2016, or the latest available date. And we categorize through different policy instruments, so energy taxes, carbon taxes, and ETS. So starting with energy taxes, we see that most of the revenue actually goes to the general budget. But we also see that there is a substantial part other that is in most countries actually earmarked towards investments in road infrastructure. So if we look at carbon taxes, we see that most of the revenue is returned indeed to households or firms. Unfortunately, we are unable to distinguish between the two. That would be interesting for future research. But we also see that a substantial share is going to the general budget. And for ETS, for emission trading schemes, the picture looks very different. So most of the investment is actually, most of the revenues is actually earmarked for investments in low carbon infrastructure. And some of it is also recycled back to households or firms or goes to the general budget. So the conclusion here is that there is indeed significant variation in how far carbon pricing revenues are used across instruments. So finally, let me summarize and let me summarize the key takeaways. So the first key message is that the carbon pricing landscape has really changed substantially between January 20 and August 21. So we saw that climate positive changes were mostly permanent. They were planned before COVID-19 and they were relatively broad in scope. Climate negative changes were mostly time limited measures due to COVID-19 and rather narrow in scope. And we also saw that subnational changes in carbon pricing shows relatively similar patterns to those two trends. We saw that changes in carbon pricing and green fiscal spending is inconsistent in some countries. And what we also saw was that there is virtually no correlation between countries' wealth and the direction of carbon pricing change. The second key message is that progress on carbon pricing has been mixed. So on the good side is COVID-19 did actually not derail the planned implementation of or increase of carbon pricing. So we observed some minor administrative difficulties and delays due to lockdowns, but overall, all carbon pricing schemes were implemented as scheduled. So then some countries announced new or strengthened carbon pricing to date. So that includes, for example, the European Union, Canada, Denmark, Israel, and Indonesia. But only very few countries have actually explicitly integrated carbon pricing into the recovery package. So Denmark is here one of the few examples. And finally, what we also saw is that potential revenue from carbon pricing is quite substantial. So 30 euros per ton carbon price would raise revenue worth 1.88% of GDP in OECD and G20 countries. The revenue recycling mechanisms is really crucial for influencing the political acceptability of carbon pricing. But if we look at the actual revenue use, we also saw that it differs substantially across carbon pricing instruments. So with that, I would like to conclude. Thanks a lot for listening and watching. More information on the carbon market platform and on past contributions of the OECD to the platform, you can find that on our website. And if you have any question or suggestion, please reach out to me or my co-authors, Jane or Sophie. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.